Welcome learners. In this module, we are going to study about the phases of peasant movement and agrarian struggle. Welcome learners. With the conceptual introduction on the peasant movement, we shall now study about the phases of peasant movement. Peasant movement are important variants of social movements. Peasant movement in India arose during the British colonial period when the economic policies resulted in the ruin of traditional handicrafts and other small industries, leading to changes of ownership and overburdening of agrarian land and massive debt and impoverishment of peasantry. Social isolation, cultural segregation and economic exploitation have accentuated the historical processes of marginalization and political subordination of the peasants. The collective realizations and awarenesses of the peasants on these issues have resulted into the outbreak of various historical peasants' movements in the world. The objective of this model is to make the students aware of the different critical aspects of the peasant movement, the range of the issues raised by them and the changes within. In this session, typology of the peasant movements, issues raised by the peasant movements in colonial India and the peasant movements in the pre-colonial period are discussed in detail. Typology of peasant movements. Peasant movements have been studied and classified in different ways in social movement literature. Classification and formation of typologies have been understood as a way of making sense of the enormous diversity that prevails in the society. But there are several limitations of typologies too. Scholars who have studied peasant movements in India have classified these movements along several lines. According to Ghanshyam Shah, peasant movements have been grouped according to those in the pre-British and British or colonial period and in the post-independence period. Peasant movement in the post-independence period again have been classified as pre-Naxalbari and post-Naxalbari or pre-Green Revolution and post-Green Revolution. The latter has been further subdivided into movements occurring in the pre- and post-emergency period. Movements occurring in the post-Green Revolution period are termed as farmers' movements as they mainly dealt with the issues and demands of the middle and big farmers, who emerged more strongly in the post-Green Evolution period. The shift in the nomenclature is indicator for the differentiation in the nature of the actors. They have been studied by Dipankar Gupta and Tom Brace among others. Gail Omwet has classified the peasant struggles into old and new, whereby the former is known by the term peasant movements and the latter the farmer movements. A.R. Desai in his study classified these struggles in the colonial period as peasant struggles and those in the post-independent period agrarian struggles. The usage of the term agrarian struggles indicates the presence of the broad coalition consisting of peasants and other classes in these struggles. Desai further subdivides struggles in the post-independence period into two categories: the movements launched by the newly emerged proprietary classes comprising of rich farmers, viable section of the middle peasant proprietors and the landlords, and the movements launched by various sections of agrarian poor in which agrarian proletariats have been acquiring central importance. Kathleen Gow records 77 uprising and also classifies peasant movements on the basis of their goal, ideology and methods of organization. According to her, there are 5 types of revolts, namely the restorative rebellions to drive out the British and restore earlier rulers and social relations. Religious movements for liberation of the region or an ethnic group under a new form of government. Social banditry and terrorist vengeance with the idea of meting out collective justice. Mass insurrection for the redressal of the particular grievance. Gyan Shyam Shah is a critical of the above classification because he feels it places undue focus on the goals rather than upon the nature of the peasant actors or the strategies that they adapt in attaining their goals. Inspired by the framework of the class, D. N. Dhanagere believes that the peasant movement in India can be analyzed through the model of agrarian classes, though he reiterates in his study that the studies need to be both historical and comparative in nature. Oman observes that there are peasant movements that have continued till today irrespective of the changes in the political power. These movements started during the pre-independence period, but they continue till today, though their goals have undergone changes. Often, typologizing becomes difficult because of the significant overlaps between the social movements, which makes the construction of the pure categories difficult. For example, Kathleen Go documentation of the innumerable peasant revolts during the colonial period largely consisted of tribal revolts over land against the British. Another example of such an overlap is Ramachandra Guha's study of the Chipko movements in the 1970s, which is popularly understood as one of the earliest articulation of the environmental movement in our country, but was also simultaneously rising concern of the protecting and controlling Jal Jungle or Jamin as source of livelihood of the peasants in the Uttarakhand region. Similarly, peasant struggles today in special economic zones against the displacement of cultivators and other landholders no longer represent the interest of the peasants only. In this manner, it becomes evident that typologies do have their limits. In this course, we shall study the peasant movement in India on the following basis: the peasant movement in pre-colonial period and the peasant movement in post-colonial period and the peasant movement in the contemporary India. Before looking into the movements, we shall first discuss about the issues raised by the peasant movement in the colonial India. The issues raised by the peasant movements in colonial India. Historically, the peasants have come together over myriad issues. Though these issues and concerns have changed over time since the colonial period. Sometimes these movements have even gone beyond the immediate concerns of the peasants. It is interesting to see how peasant movement have got connected with the larger ongoing social movements like the national movement for the independence during the colonial period or the protest against the global capital and the land grab in the contemporary period. In the colonial period, for example, peasants rose up in protest against the changes in the property relationships and in the land tenure system, which evicted and disposed them of their rights over the land. The peasant economy before the British came to India was based on the subsistence economy, oriented towards the satisfaction of the basic needs. The British transformed Indian agriculture by creating property rights in land, drawing Indian agriculture into the larger land or world capitalist system, created land markets, encouraged a commercialization of land and changed the nature of the productive relations in land took one of the contract. As new classes came into being, profit motive became the most important interest to be sustained for the government as well as the class of the zamindars and the rentiers that they created. This conflicted with the interest of the peasant cultivators and led to their mobilization. Among other reasons for the peasant mobilization during the colonial period were the experience of the beggar or forced labor, which was widely prevalent in different forms in our society. Beggar was performed for the rulers as well as for the upper caste. The agricultural laborers and the members of the lower caste were compelled to do all kinds of work, including supplying the water to the ruler's family, constructing buildings, roads, dams, carrying load from one place to another. Terrifying atrocities are part of the system, even leading to the death of the few peasants. In fact, poor peasants rose up against this exploitative system in several places like Oudh, Telangana in the colonial period and in Banasakanta district of the Gujarat and Naxalbari region in the years after independence. Rise in the prices of inferior food grains consumed by the tenants and the agricultural laborers led to several agrarian unrest in the North India in between the 1918 and 1922. Kapil Kumar found that tensions in the rural society of Oudh were because of the rise in the prices of the essential commodities, especially during the war period. Eviction of tenant cultivators by the money lenders, landlords and the government officials was one of the causes for the widespread disturbances which involved peasants. The auctioning of the land for the collection of the land revenue by the East India Company and the emergence of the new owners of the land, namely the government officials and the traders, led to the eviction of the common people and cultivators from the land. These new owners raised the rent and evicted the cultivators on the pretext of getting more rent. The revolt of 1857 was a rebellion against the collusion between the British officers and the moneylenders. Though occupancy rights were conferred on the tenants in Bengal by the Rent Act of 1859, agrarian movement continued in the Pabna and other areas of the eastern and central Bengal who wanted their tenancy rights to be secured and saw in this act an opportunity to do so. In some cases, the religious issues got implicated with the economic issues, as in the case of the Mopla rebellion in the Malabar, where the conflict between Moplas, that is the Muslim peasants, and the upper caste Hindu landlords in the late 19th century and 20th century, and in the case of Wahhabi Parsi uprisings in the Bengal in the 1930s. The peasants' protests were against the exploitation and oppression perpetuated on them by the landlords who were from the Hindu community. Religion provided a sense of solidarity and unity to the protesting peasants. Doing away with the rights of occupancy which was conferred on the tenants of Bengal was a central issue in the peasant struggle, as landlords did not want to honor the act. Their control over the tenants was so strong that they succeeded in evicting from their land, dishonoring their inheritable rights of occupancy. Similar issues led to the peasant movements in Rajasthan in early 20th century and Telangana movement during the late 1940s and early 50s. Peasant movements in the pre-colonial period. Indian peasants were adversely affected by the exploitation during the British administration. Conversely, in the response to the colonial exploitation, peasants fought against the Britishers in a larger context. As the time changed, resistance behavior of the peasants' cause also changed. They started to fight for their demands and the injustice done to them. This behavior became more volatile and action was taken after 1858. The 19th century experienced many peasant agitations such as the famous Santhal and Indigo revolt in Bengal and others in Punjab and Maharashtra. But not a single movement survived in an organized form to exert pressure or influence the administration. Gandhi and his supporters organized the peasants of Champaran, Bihar against the exaction of the indigo planters in 1917. And in Gujarat, Gandhi led the famous Kera Satyagraha against the realization of the land revenue in 1918. In 1928, the Bardoli Satyagraha against the enactment of the land revenue was organized by Sardar Patel. Indigo Peasants Revolt was the most popular movement in 1859 to 60 in Bengal. During this time, the peasants were forced to cultivate indigo and sell them at cheaper rates to the British. The peasants refused to cultivate indigo as it made the lands infertile and barren forever. The Britishers used coercive as well as brutal way to beat the peasants who refused to cultivate the indigo. The peasants community got frustrated with the anti-peasant attitude of the government. They decided to refrain from cultivating indigo. A campaign was started by the intelligentsias of the Bengal to garner support to the cause of the peasants. The government was compelled to appoint a commission for investigation and mitigation of the system. But still, the battle could not be solved and the oppression of the British and the resistance of the peasants continued. Similarly, the indigo peasants of Bihar revolted on a large scale in Darbhanga and Champaran in 1866 and 68. Peasant unrest again started in 1870 in East Bengal against the zamindars who were infamous for their notorious acts for oppressing the tenants. These zamindars freely indulged in taking recourse to rejection, harassments, illegal seizure of property including crops and chattels and extortions and large-scale use of force to increase the rents and to prevent the peasants from acquiring the occupancy rights. The North Bengal peasants also had a long tradition of resistance since 1782 against the East India Company's revenue farmer Debi Singh. From 1872 to 1876, the peasants unitedly fought against the zamindars and their agents. But the use of violence, the government was able to suppress the peasant movement, resulting in further unrest. It ended after the government promised to take action on the zamindari oppression. But this time, again, large section of the new intelligentsia gave support to the peasants' cause. Agrarian unrest in Pune and Ahmednagar districts of Maharashtra, major agrarian unrest was seen in 1875. The British government directed the settlement of revenue with the peasants. It was quite impossible for the peasant community to pay the revenue since the government had increased the rates very high. They borrowed money from the money lenders who charged high interest rates. More and more land got mortgaged and sold out to the money lenders who tried their level best to acquire and buy. Legal and illegal ran out. Got exhausted, the peasants' patience means by the end of the year 1875 and the huge agrarian knots took place. Police failed in meeting the fury of the peasants' resistance, which was suppressed only when the whole military force at Pune took the field against them. Once again, the modern intelligentsia of Maharashtra supported the peasants' demands, but it pointed out that the source of the misery of the peasants was high revenue rates and the government's incapabilities to provide loans at cheaper rates. Peasants' unrest also took place in other parts of India such as North Kerala and Assam. The situation further aggravated the people of Assam too because of high land revenue assessments. The peasants could not afford the high revenue demands of the landlords. They fought against the land revenue collectors who attempted to seize their lands. The situation worsened and the police brutally suppressed the peasants' agitation. Consequently, many peasants were killed ruthlessly and brutally in the riots. The peasant unrest movements and the riots did not influence or create any threats to British rule. But these protests proved that Indian peasants had reactions which were instant and spontaneous in every situation. During this period, the main reason for a series of spontaneous peasant uprising in different parts of the country was high-handedness of the zamindars or the landlords along with the excessive rates of the land revenue. The situation in the rural areas was aggravated by the periodic recurrence of the famines and economic depression during this period, leading to a number of peasant revolts. Notable peasant movements of this phase are the Santhal Rebellion, the Maratha Uprising, the Bengal Tenant Struggle, the Oudh Insurrection, the Punjab Kisan Struggle in the last phase of the 19th century, the Champaran Satyagraha, the Kheda Satyagraha and Mopla Rebellion in Malabar. Champaran and Kheda were the prominent movements led by the Indian National Congress under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi. The peasant movement initiated by the Indian National Congress in 1917 and 18 were restricted to seeking relief against the excessive rates of land revenue and were in no case directed against the zamindars. The Congress policy of safeguarding the interest of the zamindars and landlords led to the emergence of independent class organization of the Kisans in the rural India. Consequently, the Kisan organization came into existence in different parts of the country. Kisan Sabha movement. The Kisan Sabha movement started in Bihar under the leadership of the Swami Sahajanand Saraswati, who had formed the Bihar Provincial Kisan Sabha in 1929 in order to mobilize the peasant grievances against the zamindari attacks on their occupancy rights. Gradually, the peasant movement intensified and spread across India. In Andhra Pradesh, it launched anti-settlement agitation against the zamindari zulum in 1927. Also, a powerful struggle was initiated against the oppressive forest laws in South India in 1927. Similar movements were led in Uttar Pradesh and other parts of India against the tyranny of the zamindars. All these radical development on the peasants' front culminated in the formation of the All India Kisan Sabha at the Lucknow session of the Indian National Congress in April 1936, with Swami Sahajanand Saraswati elected as the first president. All India Kisan Sabha was composed of radical forces within and outside Indian National Congress and was also supported by the Congress Socialist Party and later the Communist Party of India. Communists were the major force that mobilized the peasants. Communist Party of India started serious engagement with the peasantry after the formation of All India Kisan Sabha. CPI increased its membership in the peasant front and set the stage for the most revolutionary struggles in the countryside. The CPI adopted itself to work at the grassroots level and in the countryside through the Kisan Sabha, which initially was not a class-based organization, and rich farmers were well represented in it. In 1941 to 43, the All India Kisan Sabha passed into the hands of the CPI, which under the Swami Shajanand tried to build the Kisan Sabhas, an organization of the rural poor, and thus alienating the rich and the middle farmers. By 1944 to 45, the CPI had complete control over the Kisan Sabha. Thus, the Kisan Sabha became an organization of the poor peasants, tenants, sharecroppers and landless agricultural labourers. It is with this base that it could launch and lead agrarian struggles in the pre-independence period. Conclusion. Though it is hard to say whether the peasant movement and their revolts contributed substantially to the larger and more distant goals of the complete restructuring of the social order, yet their significance lies in raising fundamental issues about the land, lives and the livelihood. The state responded to their agitations by initiating the land reforms, imposing the Land Ceiling Act, abolishing the zamindari system, though these reforms remain unfinished as yet. To conclude, in this session, we have studied about the different typological classification of the peasant movements in India. The phases of peasant movement are categorized as peasant movements in pre-colonial period, peasant movements in post-colonial period and peasant movements in contemporary India. In this module, we have studied in detail about the issues raised by the peasant movement in the colonial India and the peasant movement in pre-colonial period. These movements laid the base for the further other peasant movements in India. The other phases of peasant movements will be studied in detail in the next session. Thank you.